Over the decades, there's been some truly iconic war films based around British forces, from Bridge on the River Kwai, The Dam Busters, and Zulu, to more modern-made ones such as Dunkirk, Kajaki, and 1917. But of course, for every film that is remembered and played often, many are forgotten. The following 10 films don't all live up to the lofty expectations of their betters, but I believe all of them deserve to be seen at least once. One of the very few British films set during the Korean War, based on the novel of the same name by Max Cato from 1953. Following a small patrol that is cut off during the retreat of 1951 and find themselves holding a little temple on top of a hill against a large Chinese force. Despite the time of its release, the film covers some fairly heavy topics, such as the use of national servicemen, who were described as old enough to fight but too young to vote, and friendly fire. Most notable in this film is a little bit of casting, which features both Stanley Baker and Michael Caine, a full 8 years before they played the leads in Zulu. In fact, this is Michael Caine's first film role, and it is little more than that of an extra. Caine himself is a veteran of the Korean War, and believes he was cast due to this, but has since pointed out that any suggestion he made to make it more true to life was ignored. The film is dated in some ways with a very typical story setup, and utilises a white actor to play a South Korean character. But on the whole, it is enjoyable if you're a fan of Last Stand kind of films. Another film about a topic that is rarely covered in film in the West, the Chinese Civil War, based on a true story on the attack on the HMS Amethyst on the 20th of April 1949 by the People's Liberation Army. The attack would lead to the death of 47 Royal Navy personnel, killed both on board the Amethyst and other ships that came to her aid after she ran aground, as well as up to 252 casualties on the Chinese side. After the attack and the retreat of the aid ships, the Amethyst was run aground and the crew had to find a way out. It is these events that are dramatised in the film, starring Richard Todd, 2 years before his most famous role of Guy Gisborne in The Dam Busters, and William Hartnell of Doctor Who fame. Although semi-popular during its release, being the 15th most popular film in the UK that year, it had no lasting impact, something the director would come to blame on the far more famous film Battle of the River Plate that was released the year before. An enjoyable film for anyone that enjoys depictions of the Royal Navy, especially in a time period just after the Second World War that isn't normally covered, and generally just a good slight adventure film based on true events, which I think you might enjoy. Now this is not technically a British film. It's an Italian, Spanish and French-made spaghetti war film, but is largely based in Britain and the main heroes are in the British Army. The film opens during the evacuation at Dunkirk. A small group of British soldiers are taking part in a rearguard action to stop a German tank column. Their job done, they begin to fall back to the beaches. During this, some are ambushed and killed by a group of what appears to be British soldiers. In reality, they are German soldiers in British uniform, who soon disappear into the hundreds of thousands of men awaiting evacuation. Once they're in Britain, their mission becomes clear. They are on a secret mission to destroy the radar systems around the south coast and London. A deadly game of cat and mouse begins as these infiltrators kill their way across the capital to try and stay one step ahead of the British, and a number of radar systems are also destroyed. The film comes to a climax as our heroes face off with the remaining members of the German team while the Battle of Britain rages overhead, with the fate of the whole country at stake. Now you will quickly realise that historically this film is so wrong. Locations, events, weapons, tanks, planes, equipment, all is incorrect, and it is probably the only film you will see BF-109s passed off as Hurricanes and Spitfires being passed off as 109s. But if you can look past that, it's a great little film to sit down and turn your brain off for. It is directed by Enzo G. Castellara, who went on to direct the original Inglourious Basterds some 9 years later, so if you've seen that, you know what to expect. Set in an unknown African country, but most likely Kenya due to the hints we are given, in the dying days of the British Empire, as more and more African nations were being handed back to their people. During this, soldiers from the former King's African Rifles attempt a coup against their new post-colonial government, leading to a small group of veteran British NCOs and a newly arrived private under siege in the sergeant's mess, defending a wounded captain and a UN secretary. Cut off and alone, they are forced to fight for their lives and await for help. The true heart of the film is Regimental Sergeant Major Lauderdale, played incredibly by the late Richard Attenborough. He's the typical tough sergeant major of that period, who has his beliefs and prejudices called into question over the course of the film. Once again, I'm stretching the terms here a bit. Warriors is not a film per se, it's a two-part miniseries. It follows a group of British soldiers during a peacekeeping mission in the Bosnian War. The name comes from the warrior fighting vehicles they use, but it is also used ironically, that although they are heavily armed and well trained, due to the rules of engagement set on them by the UN, these warriors are unable to do anything to stop the horrors unfolding around them. They take fire and men die, but they can't retaliate as they don't know where the firing is coming from. They try to save whole villages of civilians, only to be ordered to leave them, knowing full well that doing so will mean their deaths. It's a bleak film, but gives a slight insight to the impossible decisions that had to be made in those kind of situations. Made in 1999, only a few years after the actual events, it has early starring roles for both Owen Griffith of Hornblower fame and Damian Lewis, who went on to play Richard Winters in Band of Brothers 2 years later. Our next film seems very much unknown. I've only ever heard of two other people talking about it online, and one of them was the writer-director Stuart Urban. An Ungentlemanly Act covers the opening days of the Falklands War and the Argentinian invasion of the islands, and the determined but outnumbered attempt to defend them by Royal Marines and the Falklands Defence Force. It follows the island's governor, Rex Hunt, played by Ian Robinson, and the commander of the Royal Marines, Major Mike Norman, played by Rob Beck, as the events unfold around them. It was made in 1992, 10 years after the war itself, and features several cameos from people who were really involved. It has its problems. I believe that some of the information is now outdated, as reports have since been declassified, shedding more light on what happened. It also shows the Falklands Defence Force in a less than stellar light, but overall it's an enjoyable film, and one of the very few that covers the Falklands from the British perspective. For our next film, we go back to the Second World War, not only in setting, but also production. From 1944, we have The Way Ahead. Now, as you've probably guessed from a film made at this time, it is basically a propaganda film, but it is certainly one of the better ones. Starring David Niven and part written by Peter Ustinov, it is actually a semi-remake of a 40-minute film from the year before, known as The New Lot, which starred Ustinov. The film follows a fictional regiment and a newly commissioned second lieutenant played by Niven, from shortly after Dunkirk, joining his new company, which is a mix of veterans, eager recruits, and those who don't want to be there, as they rebuild the regiment, grow closer together before they ship out to North Africa. Rather than doing the normal El Alamein Western Desert campaign shown in many British war films, they take part in Operation Torch and land in Algeria, where they fight through into Tunisia. While there, they befriend a pacifist cafe owner played by Ustinov himself, and much of the final battle is defending his town from a German counterattack. Another bit of casting worth mentioning is that of John Laurie, probably most famous for his role of Private Fraser from Dad's Army. In fact, the ending shots of the film should be very familiar to any Dad's Army fan. Now, from one depiction of the Second World War to another, this time the fighting in Burma. The remnants of a British brigade headquarters are lost in the jungle trying to retreat from the Japanese. After driving a small Japanese reconnaissance force from a village, they find themselves unable to carry on and are forced to make some very difficult decisions on what to do with their wounded, the locals, and a believed spy. Now, there are some of you out there who might think this sounds an awful lot like the film and play, Longer, Short and the Tall, but it actually precedes the film by 2 years and the play by a year. This film also marks the second on our list to star Stanley Baker. For its time, it's a fairly hard-hitting anti-war film, and the truly terrible things that are done by Baker's character proves he is anything but the officer and gentleman stereotype of the British Army in films, such as played by Niven in The Way Ahead. Probably the most interesting thing about this film's production, it is actually made by Hammer Films, who are generally only thought of for their horror films. Our only First World War film on this list, and in fact a local story to me. All the King's Men tells the story of the Sandringham Company, raised from men who worked on the royal estate in Sandringham, North Norfolk. Starting at the outbreak of the First World War, the film follows them through the early months, spent wondering why they haven't been sent into the war yet, before going off to the disastrous Gallipoli campaign and their inevitable fate. Based on a true story of one of the biggest mysteries of the First World War. It was made for ITV in 1999, and it stars David Jason as Captain Beck, the commander of the company, and Maggie Smith as Queen Alexandra. Just to warn everyone, finding copies of this film can be pretty hard, and the ones that are on eBay are pretty expensive. But if you can find one for a reasonable price, it's a nice little film. It is also one of only 2 films I know that covers the British at Gallipoli. Our final film, and the most modern, both in setting and production, is The Patrol from 2013. The film follows a small British patrol during the Afghanistan War. They are a mix of regulars, territorials, and a Royal Marine. As the patrol goes on, they grow more and more disillusioned by their mission, lose faith in their equipment, and begin to question their orders, all the time being constantly stalked by an invisible enemy. Written and directed by Tom Petch, himself a former soldier, reviews on this film seem pretty split, with some saying it is one of the best modern war films they have seen, and others saying it is the worst. I won't go into how realistic it is, as even those who have served in Afghanistan seem to disagree on this. All I will say is don't go into the film expecting guns blazing action. It is a very slow burn of a film, but I say you should give it a chance. I've had a look, and 6 of these films are available to watch on YouTube for free. Links can be found in the description below. Let me know what you think about these films. Have you heard of any of them before? If you have, what do you think about them? Also, if you can think of any ones that I might not know of, just let me know in the comments below. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Feel free to subscribe and like if you wish. This was 10 underrated British war films, and this was a little bit of history.